My concern is that we have, for example, in my own ward, we have significant numbers of HMOs, and when you look at those numbers, it may be a small number as a whole, as a borough, but when you look at Norden, and then if you break Norden down into streets, there are certain streets where there are significant HMOs. In Osborne and Millard, we have numerous in the one street, which really has an impact, and I think that's what you need to look at. The same with Popley. It's significant for a road, and that's the concerns. But I also want to talk about the sort of real issues of HMOs. We have landlords who are holding tenancy agreements illegally, holding deposits illegally, and there's enormous fear from tenants not to actually talk to us. And we had someone approach us who wouldn't speak until he was able to move out because he was in fear, and they were holding it and they wouldn't give it back to him. And there's terrible practices going on. And I talked earlier on about a property that was a 3-bedroom house that had been turned into a 5-bedroom house. This family that I talked about came to my attention through another agency. Had been living in this house on this floor, and the children were struggling with schooling because they're having to sleep on the floor. He was charging them more money because they were a family, even though they had one room, so they were paying more than anyone else. There was one bathroom in the whole of the property. We had 12 people sharing that house, and some very unsavoury people in there, and so the family were very vulnerable. And they had numerous sockets being used, but the reality from a housing perspective is that we didn't have a duty to them, and the point system, it was very difficult to move them, so they was in there for some time. So from a fire point of view and from a risk point of view, they were living in those conditions and had been living there for a long time. Also that the landlord had held the deposit illegally as well. That happens all the time. It's happening regularly. In Millard and Osborne, we have streets where there are 5 houses in one little close of the road, and there's lots more in that road. And parking is very, very difficult. And also, the house has the insulation between the houses is poor, and you have, for example, that family would be in that bedroom upstairs, 4 of them, and next door would be a child trying to go to sleep, so it's almost impossible. So there's real concerns about that, about the standard of people's and what they're living in. I think there's lots more properties out there than we're aware of. They only come to light when there's a complaint. And I don't know where that one is, whether that one was on that list, or whether it was on the list and then came off. But if you look at the one in Normanton Road, it was so bad that the one that was mentioned in the start of the report, it refers to Councillor Paul Harvey. It was so bad that the family next door had to move out because of the abuse and the violence, and considerable violence, and that property sat empty for over 3 months. That's a social housing property that was sitting empty because it was the experience of that family was so appalling. And therefore, I think that in relation to this report, and my concerns are about the report, is we haven't really looked at what we asked you to look at in relation to the aspects of the motion. I think that I hear the sentiment of the officer in saying that they will be inspecting properties. I'd like to see how many have been inspected of the 124 properties, but I don't think there's a resource that's going to be there forevermore. And what happened in Southampton in relation to licensing, it gave a income for the council to carry out inspections and to work to ensure the highest possible standards. In speaking to the fire service, in doing our research, they don't see any difference really. I mean, they know it's mandatory, the 3 levels, but there is just as many risks, they say, in relation to having 2 levels and having the properties subdivided. It may be a mandatory requirement, but what we're saying is we need to go further than that, and we're requiring us to set a standard. It's saying to those good landlords out there that we recognise what you're doing, but it's what Southampton's experience is in having a mandatory licence. We saw the reduction in the number of poor landlords, and there are many very, very poor landlords out there, and some exceptionally horrendous things happening to the most vulnerable. And the harder it is for us to get property, and the harder it is for people to find accommodation, the more they will exploit people. And we now have a housing benefit system which says that anyone under the age of 35 will not get housing benefit unless you live in a HMO. And so they're requiring people to live, and therefore there are some very vulnerable people potentially that we will be housing or will be housed in HMOs, and we need to ensure that they're of the highest possible standards. And I think I think it would be very good practice, as do many authorities, to move towards mandatory licensing.
Thank you.